Good morning and welcome. My name is Karim Bardizi. I'm the Executive Director of the Ryerson Leadership Lab and Co-Director of First Policy Response. Welcome to this special event in partnership with the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Ryerson University, as well as the Toronto Star as media partner. To begin by telling you where I am in the west part of Toronto and where the university that we work at sits on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. We are covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. We are committed to honoring our obligations to these nations, treaties, and to justice for Indigenous peoples more generally. And in any conversation about immigration and some of the awakenings that we've seen in Canada in the last years and months, I think it's especially opportune time to create space to talk about the relationship between immigrants, Indigenous peoples, and settlers, and the relationship that will continue to play out in terms of some of the policy conversations that are happening, including that today. In the First Policy Response Project, we are creating spaces to feature Indigenous voices on our platforms, including through the FPR Contributors Fund, which supports submissions from underrepresented groups in the policy space. At First Policy Response, our goal is to bring the policy community together on the best economic and social policy ideas coming out of the pandemic. And we are especially keen to add voices and organizations that bring further diversity to our group and to this work, bringing together the front lines with the experts, with the policymakers. Today, we pay respect to those that by dint of lack of connectivity, frontline obligations, caregiving needs, other needs, can't participate real time in this conversation. We will be posting a recording later. As I mentioned earlier, this is a town hall in collaboration with the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration Integration and the Toronto Star. And in a few moments, I'll pass the mic to Nicholas Keung, immigration reporter at the Toronto Star, who will facilitate an interview with our special invited guest and moderate a discussion with our four panelists. So first today, we have Nicholas in conversation with the Honourable Marco Mendicino, the Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship for Canada. Then we'll have a moderated panel discussion with time for an audience Q&A. On that panel will be four distinguished guests. Professor Anna Triana Filodou, Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Ryerson. Rupa Banerjee, Canada Research Chair and Associate Professor, Human Resource Management, Organizational Behavior Dimensions Chair at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson. Shamira Madhani, Managing Director, Canada, and Deputy Executive Director, World Education Services. And Mohan Das, Director, Newcomer Programs and Services at Wood Green Community Services. So first we have the interview with Minister Mendicino, then the moderated panel. Following that, we'll engage in smaller breakout group discussions. Each room will have a room commentator and a specific theme. You'll be prompted to join a breakout room after the panel discussion. And the themes are, the hosts are Rula Mustafa, Building Roots Manager, Refugee Sponsorship and Resettlement Department at Islamic Family Social Services Association. Her room will focus on the experience of refugees during COVID-19. Nicholas Keung will be hosting a breakout room on the theme Policy Issues for Migrant Workers during COVID-19. Ranyan Yunus, Project Manager, National Network at Immigrant Employment Council of BC, will be hosting a breakout room on the theme of employment prospects for newcomers during COVID-19. And Joan Atlin, Director of Strategy, Policy, and Research at World Education Services, will be hosting a breakout room on the theme of what has the pandemic shown us about leveraging the skills of immigrant health professionals. Finally, we'll come back to this main room to summarize the conversations. To ask a question, you can visit slido.com and enter event code FPR11, and we'll include this in the chat box as well. Please also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box so we can get a sense of who's in the room for this plenary discussion. Lastly, please feel free to follow the conversation on Twitter. The FPR handle is Policy Response, and the Canada Excellence Research Chair's handle is CRC Migration. And with that, I'll pass it over to Anna to say a few words about the research chair and to introduce Minister Mendicino and Nicholas Keung.
Thank you very much, Karim, and thank you all for being here today. Good morning, as I said, early good morning for those on the other side of Canada. I'm delighted to be here with such a distinguished company. First of all, I want to acknowledge that I am a settler in this land. I have come to Canada 2 years ago from Europe, and I'm only learning about the Indigenous issues, and I can only second what Karim said about our obligations and our responsibilities when researching migration or discussing migration policy and bringing together issues of newcomers with the Indigenous issues and working towards social justice in Canada. Having said this, my role this morning is quite easy because I have to introduce two people that need no introduction. On one hand, I'm delighted to introduce Marco Mendicino, who is the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship of Canada, but he's also known not just for his work as a lawyer and federal prosecutor for 10 years, but as a politician, as a community activist. He was elected in 2015 at Lawrence Eglinton, not far from where I live in Toronto. And I have discovered this morning reviewing your bio, Minister, that we have another point of contact, the North Toronto Soccer Club. He's known for his work to help youth, disadvantaged people, affordable housing, public transit, and a lot of other issues that I think are broadly relevant and also related to immigration. So I think he needs no introduction, and we'll have the chance at this digital town hall to speak about some of the important, I would think, innovations that the government and the minister have introduced in the immigration system of Canada in the very last months under completely extraordinary circumstances. I had the honor to meet the minister in February 2020 at a big meeting, and who would have thought what was coming upon us a few weeks after. The second person that I'm delighted to introduce is Nicholas Keung. Nicholas, he doesn't know that I knew about him much before I met him, because everyone was telling me, you have to read the Toronto Star, you have to keep an eye on Keung. He writes the most important things that you need to know about immigration in Canada. And I have had the pleasure to read your articles in these years and learn from them, and also connect with you and realize the very important work you're doing. Nicholas has received awards for online journalism, and he has been recognized for his contribution to the immigration debate through very important and critical and very well-informed reporting. So I'll leave the floor to you two, and I look forward to your discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Karim and Anna, for the opening remarks. And I appreciate this opportunity to speak with the minister about how Canada's immigration system has weathered the COVID-19 storm. Immigration is such an important part of Canada's past and present. However, so often I feel we take Canadian immigration for granted. And I think the disruptions caused by the pandemic has shocked every one of us to think of the unimaginable. The most apparent impact, obviously, is the border closure, the stop of the movement of people, and the lockdown of overseas visa offices and local immigration offices within Canada. So how would a system that's tasked with the movement of people respond when people can move around freely? In normal times, immigration officials already are facing a lot of challenges and criticisms. They're essentially being damned for everything that they do. And during COVID-19, things have become even harder, and everything the government does with its immigration policies is constantly under close scrutiny by those whose family reunifications are delayed and whose immigration dreams are in limbo. Minister Mendicino started his job as the immigration minister in November 2019. And in March last year, you just announced Canada's most ambitious immigration plan to bring in a historical level of permanent residence for the next 3 years. And within a few days, Canada's border was shut down, and even Canadians were scrambling to return to Canada. So, Minister, here's my first question for you. So what went on in your head in that very moment when your boss announced the border would be closed?
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for the question. And just before I answer it, I also want to echo both Karim and Anna's land acknowledgement, and thank you for allowing us to start this conversation in the right way. And, you know, I wholeheartedly support the idea that as we discuss immigration, that it's important to contemplate the role that newcomers and immigrants play in advancing reconciliation in our department's work, and introducing a new oath that better reflects Indigenous peoples and a process to reclaim Indigenous names, as well as hopefully in the short term, introducing a new citizenship guide that better accurately captures our history with Indigenous peoples are all ways in which I think we can engage not only newcomers, but all Canadians to continue this meaningful work. Nick, it's great to see you, my friend, and I really want to thank you for your very thoughtful and at times importantly critical work on this file on immigration. I'll take you back to March of 2020. So step into the time machine. Actually, I was abroad. I was in Berlin at the invitation of Chancellor Merkel, giving a talk on some of Canada's successes at immigration. So we were talking about innovation, integration, digitization, and you know, it was a good trip. We came back home, and as you say, shortly after that, we had introduced our annual levels plan for 2020, which at the time would have seen us welcome 351,000 new permanent residents in 2020, a record. And then within a week later, COVID crashed on our shores and we shut down the border. And I think it's important not to gloss over what that entailed. We grounded flights, we closed airports, we docked ships, we told everyone to park their cars and their luggage and stay at home, and by and large they did. International travel fell off a cliff. It went down 95% across our border. But even as we put the brakes on, what was going through my head, and I think many of my colleagues' head at the time, was the need to keep corridors of immigration open critically for our economy. And so what we had to do in that moment was very quickly rethink and rewire an immigration system that would keep people moving across international borders while at the same time shutting it down to non-essential travel. So, you know, in short, it was the ultimate paradox. It was about keeping open doors in a closed world. And we were able to resolve that paradox in three critical ways. One, we actually wrote new laws and policies that created these new immigration corridors, which authorized entry into Canada, but layered with the effective public health and safety protocols that included, as you know, mandatory quarantining, testing, and tracing. These corridors were prioritized on the basis of the needs of the economy, and we can expand on that. The second thing that we did was we quickly looked at the areas of our immigration system that we could transition into the digital and virtual world. And so, for example, we moved some of our components of landing permanent residents online. We also completely overhauled our citizenship process, which was paper-based and in-person, and we took that and moved it online. But the third way in which I think we really began to resolve this paradox was by rethinking the way that we look at domestic temporary immigration. And that ultimately yielded the Essential Workers Pathway, which would welcome 90,000 domestic temporary immigrants who are already in Canada across a wide array of occupations, some 140 occupations that are eligible under the program, and really recognizing their contributions in a way that I don't think that as you say, that we took for granted, perhaps before the pandemic. And so in those three ways, what I think we ultimately did was we confronted the challenge of the pandemic and quickly adapted. And we did that for the purposes of protecting the promise of immigration, on which this country has been built, which is to ensure that people can continue to come to Canada and to contribute and to give back and to add to the social fabric and the diversity of our country. And certainly, you know, that was no easy task, and we continue to face challenges going forward. But those are some highlights, and it's important that we do that because immigration will create jobs, it will create further opportunities, and it will strengthen our long-term prosperity.
And what was the most challenging part of trying to run the immigration department when you were still relatively new to the job?
Well, the most challenging part was having to write a playbook on how to rewire the immigration system in the midst of the pandemic. So, you know, effectively, to sit down from tabula rasa, from scratch, and to really create these policies that would keep corridors open for our economy. But we didn't stop just at our economy. Eventually, as you know, we were also able to open up corridors for family reunification, as well as to continue the important work that Canada does in the resettlement of some of the most important and urgent cases with refugees. And as well, to keep the corridor open for international students. And, I think, so just being able to intellectually sit down and figure out what do those policies look like, what do the protocols look like, so that we can keep people moving, albeit safely and in a secure manner. But the other, I think, real challenge was to know at the same time the very human impact that this was having on people. And I read the cases that you and your everyone writes about in the press when a family can't be together or an outcome has been frustrated as a result of the pandemic. And I feel the full weight of those cases, as I know we all do. I mean, they're compelling, and I think that they're also very motivating. But I've also, I want to share with you that despite the challenges, that there are, also some very compelling stories of newcomers who have overcome the adversity of the pandemic. And I think, we have to be very sober and objective about what the work is going forward, and recognize what's at stake, which is Canada's ability to continue to not only attract people for the purposes of adding to our economy, which is very important, but to protect that promise of Canada, which is that this is a country that believes in opportunity, that believes that we can really weave together and stitch together many different peoples who bring different identities and culture and language in a way that does add to our long-term prosperity. And so, there's a real mix there of both sitting down and figuring out from an intellectual point of view, how do we write these new laws, along with, really being impacted by the many different stories that are out there that I know we all share.
Mm-hmm. So in hindsight, what do you think the department did well? And are there things that you would have done differently?
Well, one thing that I think we all did well, first, let me take a step back. I think one of the perennial criticisms of government is that it's slow to move, that it's like this big, large naval carrier that cannot turn on a dime, that it takes time and patience to move the ship in a different direction. And I think we actually rebutted that stereotype, certainly in the earliest days of the pandemic, by, as I say, shutting down the border to non-essential travel, but creating new policies to allow for the welcoming of migrant workers and international students, families and refugees that had on those corridors layered on the health protocols. So that certainly was work that had to be done very quickly, and it required a fast adaptation, as well as the introduction of I think some new services online, like the citizenship process, as I say, I think really taught us that we could move those services of submitting an application on paper online, as well as the taking of the test, which was done conventionally in person, as well as the ceremony itself in person, and quickly moving them into digital space. But I think if I had to offer one constructive criticism, to our government and to all of us, really, is that we needed a playbook going into the pandemic. And I think, we quickly realized that in the absence of having one that would allow us to sort of kick these protocols into gear, that we had to write one really from scratch. And the good news is that as a result of all of the lessons that we have learned, we've been able to address some of the internal systemic gaps within our system. So moving away from being so dependent on paper and leveraging digital technology and innovation, so that we can have a system that is less susceptible to a public health care crisis like the one that we've just hopefully gotten through. But the other thing, Nick, I would point out in terms of lessons learned is how we can't afford to take immigration for granted. And that has to do with the gaps and the challenges outside of the immigration system, or that at least are not, caused by the immigration system. And that has to do with our labor shortages, and in the food sector, in the healthcare sector, in the transportation and the building and trade sector, in the technology sector, and the fact that we can't take immigration for granted when it comes to addressing the long-term demographic challenges that we are increasingly facing. And I'll just sort of highlight that it is the worker to retiree ratio in this country that keeps me up most at night. Because about 40 years ago, it was 7 workers for every retiree, and right now we're at just a little over 3 workers for every retiree, and we're well on our way. We're barreling towards being just at 2 workers for every retiree at current trends by 2035. So if we want to avoid, if we want to protect all of the hallmarks that are attributed to the high quality of Canadian life, immigration can't entirely solve that demographic challenge, but it can certainly ease some of the pressure. And that's why we have set our immigration goals ambitiously high. It's yes to create opportunity, but it's also to address some of those other systemic gaps.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, even though the operations of IRCC, has been disrupted the last 18 months, but applications inland or from overseas still keep coming in. And I think, other than, if I'm right, other than the IRB, the Immigration and Refugee Board, that would not see any backlog and would be happy to see the backlog inventory coming down. In every single immigration program, we are expecting to see, or we have already seen a growing backlog and a longer wait time. So as we move forward, we slowly reopen our borders, are you going to shift the focus on overseas applications, or what would be the priorities? What do you see are the biggest challenges that yourself and your staff would face, in the coming months and year or two?
Well, the short answer is yes, and we've already begun to start to shift some of our energy and resources into processing applications and making sure that we can welcome people who possess certificates of permanent residency who've been waiting, for over a year and a half, very patiently, I might add, for that moment that they can come back to Canada, or come to Canada, I beg your pardon, to start their next chapter of their life. And was very pleased when, as part of stage 1 of the reopening of our borders, that we were able to lift that prohibition and begin to reopen our doors to conventional new immigration from abroad. But I also want to point out that the growth of the inventory, or what I think is described as backlogs by you and others, is very much a function of the pandemic. I mean, there were quite literally, in the case of new permanent residents, no place for them to come to as a result of the travel restrictions that not only Canada but many countries put into place. And so we now have, I think, the opportunity to not only welcome those, but to really become more efficient than we have ever been. And there are 2 parts, or 2 parts of the strategy that I think going forward are going to allow us to accomplish that goal. First, as I said, the short-term digitization and introduction of innovation into our existing policies and platforms. And we've seen that in permanent residency, in citizenship applications, in family and spousal sponsorship applications. And I think we're starting to see the results of that work already very strongly in 2021. I don't have the exact numbers yet to share with you, but I will preview that in June of 2021, just this past month, we had a record month. And that is concrete, I think, proof of the progress that we are making when it comes to accelerating our service delivery. And so I want to sound a note of encouragement, because again, while each of the cases that we see and hear about, in our public discourse, can at times be very frustrating and challenging, that we are making progress across the system. And that's as a result of the investments that we've made in hiring additional people, as I say, introducing new technologies, and also putting into place some policy flexibility to reduce the barriers that have been caused by the pandemic. But the really exciting work is that which lies ahead of us, which is going to, I think, catapult us into an entirely transformed immigration system. And in Budget 2021, I asked for and received almost $1 billion to completely modernize and transform the immigration system, Nick. And what I think that this is going to lead to is, not only better service, where you can submit any application and check on it and get a status update in real time, but it's going to lead to faster outcomes, which is to say, if you're coming to Canada to study, to work, to be reunited with your family, or just to visit as a tourist, which we hope one day in the not too distant future we'll be able to do, that those outcomes are going to be achieved a lot faster. And this really, I think cuts to the core and the heart of the push and pull of any discussion around immigration, which is, we believe that we're an open country, we're an inclusive country, but our system needs to be transformed, needs to be modernized, so that it can accommodate the great demand, the demands that are placed on it. And with the investments in our 2021 budget, we're going to be able to realize that vision, and that's work that I'm extremely invested in, as is my department.
So that's almost like a blessing in disguise, that the pandemic has pushed the transformation of the department. Am I right?
Well, I think so. And one of the adages that came up often in the context of the pandemic was, we're in the midst of this once in a century pandemic, a public healthcare crisis, the likes of which no one has seen, certainly not in my lifetime, and probably for several generations. Let's not waste this crisis. We have an opportunity, and we have tried to make full use of that opportunity. And we are making progress. We are making strides. Are there still challenges? Without any question. And as I say, when people bring cases to our attention, whether it's a colleague in the House of Commons, or a community advocate group, like, for example, I know there's been a lot of advocacy around migrant workers and making sure that we can protect their rights, because they give so much to this country. They come, they work hard, and as a result, we all benefit. But we need to do right by them. We need to be sure that their workplaces are safe and healthy. And that is work that we do in conjunction with our provincial partners, as well as the employers in that sector as well. And we should be motivated to I think live up to the expectations that are driven by the great history and tradition that we have around our immigration system, which is that it is a vehicle for opportunity, but also a way to really add to our social fabric and a diversity.
I realize that we're running out of time, but I know there are a lot of frustrated people out there, with the immigration process, especially including some who are in the audience today. So, before you go, like, what would you like to say to those frustrated people waiting in the queue, to come to Canada, or to be reunited with their families, or come here for protection, for asylum? What do you what's your final words for to tell these people?
Well, I'd say a few things in conclusion, Nick. The first is I would say to everyone who has a desire to come to Canada, or is already here and is awaiting the final determination of their status in Canada, is to keep the faith. We hear you, we see you. Each and every one of your cases matters to me and to our department and to our government, and that is motivating us on a very human level to ensure that you can achieve your full potential in Canada. And the second thing I would say is thank you for choosing Canada. For all of the ambition around the numbers of our plan, and they're important because that is the way that I believe we're going to create jobs and growth and prosperity and strength and really protect that promise. What's important to me is that there is a shift in the paradigm of the way that we talk about immigration. And I think that the pandemic has really forced us to rethink the way we view immigrants. I mean, we need to throw out the old language and the old nomenclature about ranking immigrants one against the other, low skill versus new skill. I think the pandemic has allowed us to really understand that each and every newcomer has something to contribute to our economy, to our communities, and to our country. And I think, my hope is that in some of the policies that we've introduced in the work that we've done, whether it's the essential workers pathway or some of the pathways that we've introduced in the humanitarian space, for example, the Guardian Angels program that allows asylum seekers to stay in Canada thanks to their contributions in hospitals and long-term care homes, that it will allow us all to reflect about who we are as a people. And really, this is about protecting that promise. It's about protecting the idea that there is opportunity in Canada, that you can come here, that you can cohabitate with your neighbors, your friends, your relatives, your coworkers, and that this is the way to drive our country forward. And that's really why this conversation is so important, Nick, that in any serious and thoughtful conversation about Canada's present and its future, that immigration features so prominently in it. And I think we've sort of touched on some of the reasons why I think that's the case.
And thank you so much for your time this morning, Minister.
Thank you, Nick. It's always great to be with you.
Awesome. So I hope we all have a better insight into the thinking of the minister's reopening plan. And let's turn to our panel now. And we have today with us a distinguished panel of speakers who have all sorts of expertise about the Canadian immigration system. And they're here to share about, with us about our lessons learned during the pandemic and what should come next. And I will have one question for each of our panelists to lead off this pandemic discussion. But first, I'd like to ask each of you for a quick reflection of our interview just now with the minister. What's your takeaway from what the minister just said? And maybe we can start off with Anna. Sorry to put you on the spotlight first.
Thank you, Nick, and I like your questions. I think that the minister didn't surprise me in that he is very positive and celebratory. I take note of the idea of, we have to change the narratives, do not pity migrants against each other in terms of skill. So this is signaling something new, and we'll discuss this, I think, more concretely in the next hour. The second thing I'm keeping, which worries me a bit, is this emphasis on efficiency. So he said that we're going to modernize the migration system, but I think, and knowing what the IRCC is up to, they're changing their the whole how can I say, operating system, which you can imagine is huge. At least my data are in there, and maybe the data of many of the people here. So I heard efficiency. I heard we're going to modernize, but that's technical. I didn't hear any reflection about, the political direction of where this is going beyond the celebratory. I think I'll leave it at that. And so look forward to the further discussion.
Good. How about you, Rupa?
Yeah, I mean, I was happy to hear a lot of the points that he was making. And I actually agree that a lot of the moves early in the pandemic that the government made, really were quicker than what we may have expected from the government. I feel that the integration side of migration and integration needs to be connected here a little bit more. So he spoke a lot about selection, a lot about modernization, but at the end of the day, those do not exist in a vacuum. And we know that newcomers face so many difficulties and challenges once they arrive in Canada. And I think those challenges need to be integrated into the whole selection system as well.
Yeah, great. And Shamira, what are your thoughts?
Sure, I'll build on what Rupa and Anna have said. I mean, our country was pretty nimble. Unlike other countries where they closed down borders, we basically were intentional in terms of what we did in the immigration front. Yes, the minister talked a lot about transformation, digitization, innovation. We really do need to think about the fact that there are countries that may not be able to be what we call efficient in terms of digitizing, which means we're now going to create barriers for individuals who are coming from countries where they don't have the digitization methods. So, I think the government will need to be very intentional around not, increasing barriers and just bringing people from countries where, technology is basically very sophisticated. The third thing is, where Rupa was going is that I think it's going to be really important that we don't just meet the targets. And, I was happy that we've continued to meet the targets and the minister talked about progress, but we also have to be intentional. It's not just about having people come in and fill jobs. It's about coming in and using the previous skills and experience so we can continue to remain competitive. So I hope that we can talk about that in the next time.
And how about you, Mohan? Your expertise is actually on the front line, providing settlement and integration services for newcomers.
Yeah, so I concur with Rupa in terms of immigration is not just about the migration process of bringing people here, but it's also about the integration process that's important, right? Like how do they become citizens and how do they help themselves and help Canada? And in that, I think what the minister presented fell a little short on that because he talked about $1 billion investment in the immigration process, which is really heartening to hear. But since the pandemic started, while settlement service agencies like ourselves have been allowed to repurpose money in our existing budget to invest in innovation, in technology and things that we needed to pivot to a virtual service model or different service delivery model, but no new dollars were made available. And I don't see that going forward also, which I think is going to become a big challenge. We have these targets, that's great. We might even achieve that, which is even greater. But what happens to them when they're here? Unless we invest in expanding and innovating and improving settlement services, these people are going to continue to struggle being here. And also being in a post-pandemic recovery phase where employment is not going to be the same level it was in 2019 or 2018. And things, housing and all of that is not going to be the same as the post-pandemic period, pre-pandemic period, sorry. Yeah. I think that challenge is going to still continue.
Great. And yeah, interesting observations from all of you. I think, it would provide, a good backdrop, for our panel discussion and for our breakout discussion. As I said, I did prepare a question for each of you. So we'll go with Anna first. So this past February, the government issued invitations to over 27,000 candidates in the express entry applicant pool. The usual number of invitations ranges from 3,500 to 5,000 per draw. So what are the lessons learned from the unprecedented draw of the 27,000 people in mid-February? And what is the role of temporary migrants in the Canadian economy and society of the future?
Yeah, I think that there are a few lessons learned. Well, of course, one positive lesson was that Canada was signaling clearly to people who were here with a temporary permit of different kinds that we want you to stay, and we want to facilitate this. Now, I'm pretty sure that the audience in this seminar is expert, but just to give a sense of how radical this was. Normally, you needed more than 450 points to be selected, in this virtual big pool where you were floating and they take the phone, and you had to be, so when you rose at 450 or more, you would be selected, invited to apply for permanent residency. And that day on, I think it was 15th of February, the lowest score was 75. So it was unprecedented. Now, I think that there were two issues there. It was the idea of filling the quotas, because it was clear that we wouldn't be able to fill the quotas of the 400,000 people in 2021, because international travel is taking a long time to normalize, and we're only seeing it happening, hopefully, this summer going forward. Second, as I said, I think it was a strong signal for people who are here. At the same time, the problem is probably this kind of undermined the essence of the point system. Then people start thinking, okay, are we changing the rules? When I'm trying to play by the rules, are we changing the rules? I'm also a little bit puzzled about why not? I mean, the government could have done 5 draws of 5,000, right? But they chose to do one of 27,800. So some people say that the reason for that was to see if there would be backlash because it was discussed in the media. Other people say that this was to create a call effect. It is interesting to know now, I mean, after a few months, that the next draws were normal again. But then we saw the other program that we will talk in a minute, the 90,000 facilitating the transitions. So what I'm learning from that is the Canada, and I want to emphasize the comparative dimension, because the minister also mentioned that. He said, thank you for choosing Canada, and he said we shouldn't be too complacent that people will come. So I want to say that in this sense, Canada is very different, for instance, from Australia, which by all other respects can be very well compared to Canada as a country that is proactively managing its immigration. And what Australia has done is basically during the pandemic, it said, literally, as I say, the Prime Minister said, oh, for those of you who are temporarily here, this is the time to make your way back home. And they didn't provide, the equivalent of the CERC for temporary people. They left a lot of people stranded. They didn't facilitate, those with temporary permits that were expiring or were being canceled for all sorts of reasons. And they don't have right now a proactive immigration policy. So we can see that Canada is also giving, in my view, a signal to the world, so to speak, or to the prospective migrants. So this is my lesson learned. Now, of course, going forward, I think what we need is more, not to worry too much, are we doing away with the importance of skills because we're accepting people? Because I'm pretty clear that even those who scored 75 were probably, first of all, skilled, and second, because they were here, because all the people were invited through the Canadian Experience class, these were people that have networks in Canada, they have work experience. So maybe they don't have the so high formal skills or educational qualifications, but they have other elements that would facilitate their labor market integration in Canada and their overall integration in Canada. So this is one recognition that I see. And second, perhaps we can say that this is a precursor of reconsidering what skills mean. And I heard also the minister saying that we have realized through the pandemic that we don't, I mean, he didn't say we don't only need the engineers and the doctors, etc., or the people with MAs and BAs, but he said we've realized we need people in the construction industry, in the agri-food sector, in the care sector, and of course he also mentioned IT. So it was an indirect, I think, acknowledgement that we need more people probably in the trades category, or we need new categories, or we need new ways. And I know Rupa and Shamira, and I'm sure also Mohan, have thoughts and have done work on this, on how to codify other types of skills, or how to reconsider how we give points. And I leave it at that.
Very, very good. Some very important points that you've raised. I was just actually taking notes, for our, further discussion and Q&A later. And how about you, for Rupa? In April, the government introduced a new pathway to permanent residency for over 90,000 essential temporary workers and international graduates. It was such a big news story at the time. I think it was in early May. So was this actually a good decision in your opinion?
So in my view, I mean, this is a step in the right direction. Again, I think it's an important signal that the government was trying to send in terms of the way it was publicized. The essential worker piece of that announcement was really put forward as being the the most important headline there, is that 90,000 essential workers. But if you actually dig down and look at who was actually invited, it's a little bit different than that. 20,000 were from 40 healthcare occupations, 30,000 were from 95 essential occupations, and 40,000, so a really large proportion, were actually international students, so former international students who completed a degree from a Canadian institution. So in that sense, I think that there's a bit of PR in pushing this to be, a big infusion of essential workers, where perhaps it wasn't quite that. In my view, the fact of the matter is this is another pilot program. It's time limited till November 5th. And although the numbers are large, the actual numbers of the essential workers are not as large. And I think the other piece that I really want to point out is that the majority of the individuals within that 90,000 allocation are still high skill, what we call NOC skill A or B occupations. So by definition, international graduates, international students who graduated from university in Canada are high skilled. And the vast majority of the healthcare occupations are also high skilled. Only 3 of the eligible healthcare occupations were what we would deem lower skilled. And about half of the other essential occupations were deemed lower skill. So this is an area that I do think is a gap in our current economic immigration program. We know that from speaking to employers, from looking at the data in terms of labor demand, that we're going to need workers in all sectors, in all levels and occupations. And so, while our high skilled immigration system is kind of, the envy of the world and is something that we're very proud of and is something that we should stick to, I think there's still room within our immigration system to allow a stable and ongoing allocation of lower skilled workers that will fulfill roles that are really, really needed and will be needed. And many of these jobs are currently being done by temporary foreign workers. And so those folks already have experience in Canada. They already have the networks that we were speaking of. So, providing pathways for those individuals, those temporary foreign workers who currently, come year after year, contract after contract, really should be given the opportunity to apply for PR. Then I think that along with that, I want to emphasize that the integration piece for those individuals is extremely important. So providing settlement services to those who would be eligible for PR and who are working in a lower skill occupation is an essential part of the puzzle, because those are the individuals who oftentimes end up working here with absolutely no resources to actually improve their language skills or actually take those steps to become more connected in their communities. And if we provide those settlement services from the beginning, by the time they get access to PR or pathways to PR, then they'll be ready to go. They'll hit the ground running. So it's a step in the right direction, but I think there's a lot more. Yeah.
And that has been a big issue about, the eligibility for settlement services, given that, the system has growingly geared towards, bringing in temporary residents than permanent residents, right, over the years. Very good points, Rupa. And for Shamira, so what does an immigration inclusive recovery look like to you? And how do we ensure we move forward by building a better labor force in which employers can assess, recognize, and integrate education and skills gained outside of Canada? I think that's a point that you raised earlier, about, not just to, focus on the folks who have already the Canadian work experience and academic credentials, but how about, bringing in not just to fill jobs, but to utilize the skills and talents that, those coming from overseas, without a Canadian education or work experience, how they could contribute and be, to have the skills utilized.
So Nicholas, I'm going to go into the meso level in terms of, so what happens to people who come to Canada and what are the expectations and aspirations and actually what happens to them? World Education Services had done a research report in 2019 where we had interviewed almost 14,000 individuals, and less than half of those individuals who were here were working in their former occupations. They were either underemployed or in totally different occupations, which meant that the country was losing, their experience and skills. The whole issue of underemployment, unemployment is a long-standing issue. I remember 20 years ago talking about doctors driving cabs. Now we talk about doctors driving Ubers. So, we really do need to think about being very intentional about leveraging skills that people bring. As I said in my comments around what the minister said, this isn't just about bringing people in and take any job. It's about using people's deep experience. And, with COVID, we already know that certain sectors basically were impacted in a very negative way where immigrants were working, hospitality, accommodation, tourism. And then they became essential workers, in long-term care facilities as PSW workers, where we know that many are nurses and doctors, etc. So, for me, in terms of where we go with this, we have data that shows that in terms of what immigrants can contribute. So RBC estimated that Canada forgoes $50 billion in GDP due to immigrant wage gap, brought in by three factors: underemployment, lower wages, and poor recognition of skills and experience. In terms of, what we need to do, I have three suggestions, happy to have a conversation after. One is that we need to have a national strategy to enhance immigrant labor market integration. We all have these conversations in silos. We'll talk to government, we'll talk to post-secondary institutions, we'll talk to licensing bodies, we'll talk to employers, but there isn't one table with leadership from the federal government to talk about what does this look like from an inclusive economic recovery, and what's the best plan for it. The second, from my perspective, is to have policies and programs in place that are intentional on those that have been impacted greatly. So, we know women have been impacted, but racialized women have been impacted the most. And we know in the healthcare sector, again, we could leverage the skills in the long-term care sector, etc. They're begging to work as doctors, and we just keep on saying, yeah, but there are barriers and there are no spaces. So, we need to think about a targeted approach for young people, for racialized women, for people who are in the lower skills. You heard Rupa and Anna talk about that, because it isn't just about highly skilled. And then the third is developing innovative tools and approaches. So I think everybody knows at World Education Services, we provide reports for where we have assessed academic qualifications. Those reports are recognized, it opens doors. But the area that really needs more work is around assessment of skills and experience. People keep on saying, oh, but you don't have Canadian experience. But what does that mean? That's very abstract. What they're really saying is, I don't understand how your experience and your skills from another country translates into my workplace. I'd like to hire you, but I don't know, what that means. Your resume doesn't tell me anything. So for me, and other people have heard me talk about this, is a digitized skills passport, where somebody basically is not just presenting a report that talks about academic assessment and then a resume. It's really a digitized wallet that would give them, here's what your academic qualifications look like, here's what your skills look like and how it translates into the workplace, here's where you worked, and that could be carried around by an individual and recognized by all the decision makers. Aspirational, I'm happy to talk about that.
I'm sure you're very passionate, for these issues. So Mohan, I have a question for you as well. So what challenges have settlement agencies experienced during the pandemic, and how will these challenges impact the integration of newcomers, particularly the cohorts that arrived during the pandemic? And what does the settlement sector need to address the issues that have come to the fore during the pandemic?
Thank you, Nicholas. And I think that those were all excellent points, Anna, Shamira, and Rupa. So one thing that the pandemic exposed was a bitter truth that all of us knew in the sector for a long time, which is that there has not been any investment for more than at least a decade and a half, and I can say that because I've been in the sector for more than a decade and a half, there's not been any investment in innovation or in improving technology-enabled services. For about 10 years, we were talking about virtual language classes, but there's been not a single dollar invested in bringing that up, in developing that model further. Right? So what this pandemic exposed, when in March 18th or 19th of last year, when all of us had to close down and move all of our services overnight to a virtual mode, was that we were left with no resources. We had like our staff, not even all of our staff had laptops to take home and work from home, right? So we were scrounging, we were really struggling to find resources, and also to have a service delivery strategy that included a virtual mode of delivery was not there. And that simply was because no investments have been made in the last 15 years in innovating and developing the sector. Right? The other side of the same problem that we realized when we moved virtual was that even though we managed to move all of our services to a virtual mode, we were seeing that newcomers were struggling to connect. And that was mostly because either lack of digital literacy in newcomer populations where there was a lower social capital, or simply even in enabled newcomers, it was access to reliable internet or internet-enabled devices. There were families had one laptop, but the kids had to use that for school. The mom had to use it, or the dad had to use it to find work or for work. And they were all struggling to access services because they were severely challenged with that. And not to mention refugees or government-assisted, government-sponsored refugees or refugee claimants who came here, who have additional layers of barriers already, and how they were able to access services. So for settlement services, the challenges itself were always there. The pandemic exposed those challenges. But worrying is that we still haven't learned from that. So the $1 investment in digitizing and innovating the immigration process stopped short of innovating or investing in settlement services, right? In terms of challenges for newcomers. So in settlement services, we know that the first 6 months for enabled clients to some years for newcomers with lower social capital is the settlement period, is the integration period, right? And for people who came during the pandemic period, and let's not forget the people who came just before the pandemic period, from let's say October of 2019 to March of 2020, they were not still yet integrated at all, right? So for this group of people, the challenge has been, I can probably talk all day about those challenges, but to start off, the first challenge was accessing services or understanding and finding out about services. A lot of people come from countries where settlement services is not the norm. They are not aware of what, when I first came to this country, I didn't know what settlement services meant. It took me a year to find out about settlement services. And in a pandemic situation, for a newcomer, not knowing what a settlement service is, and then to understand about settlement services and to find that in a pandemic situation is really, really challenging. Right? So we had our services open, but we could see that newcomers weren't connecting to our services essentially. And there was no way that we could do the same kind of outreach or marketing that we did earlier, because we were not able to go into communities. We were not able to go into partner locations and promote our services. So we had to move our outreach and marketing completely digital. We took some time because, again, we didn't have any resources. The other thing is, we all know that when newcomers come here, even qualified newcomers get into what we call a survival jobs, right? So these are survival jobs that sustain them during the period while they're putting other things together. They are accessing other services to settle and integrate here successfully. But like Shamira mentioned, all of these survival jobs are in the hospitality, retail, in the logistics or manufacturing sector, all of which were completely wiped out because of the pandemic situation. Right? So this is a group of people that are already struggling to find jobs, and even those survival jobs were wiped out. Again, the federal government and the provincial governments had come out with a lot of benefits, and kudos to them. But if you remember the first 6 to 8 months, these benefits changed. The eligibility criteria changed so much. And also the process of applying to these benefits was so confusing and complex for newcomers who are not used to those kind of benefits or those kind of government resources or services. Right? So even when the CERP benefit was announced and the eligibility criteria was decided, we were seeing that newcomers were not able to access that simply because they didn't understand who was eligible and who was not eligible. And even when they did, for them to apply for that, the tedious and the tenuous process and all the paperwork that they had, that they wanted help, showed us that they were not connecting to the services effectively. Not to mention the cumulative effect of all of this on the mental health of newcomers, right? So settlement service agencies, we are not equipped to provide mental health services. We are not in the business of providing mental health services, but we are the ones that newcomers connect with for everything, because they come to us, one, because we speak their language, we look like them, and we understand their issues. So now we are forced to now deal with the newcomers, not with just with their settlement challenges, but also their mental wellness challenges. So connecting, finding them culturally competent mental health service providers. You know how difficult it is to connect to a psychiatrist, to get an appointment with a psychiatrist, leave alone to get an appointment with a psychiatrist who could speak your language or who understands your cultural background. Right? So mental health has also been a big issue for newcomers. Now, what can we do to make sure that we learn from this and we become better? First, we need to solidify some of the service delivery models that we were put together. But these have all been put together without any resources. So have a formal strategy within the sector, and IRCC, the provincial government, to provide support for settlement service agencies to develop a formal model of virtual service or even a hybrid model of service. Because even when we reopen, we should not lose all that we have learned in the last 18 months, right? So how do we learn that, and how do we develop a model of service and implement all of the resources that we require to implement that? The other thing is expand capacity. So we are talking about from 350,000, you want to bring in 400,000 people. That's great. But all of the people who came in the 18 months and the 6 months before the pandemic are still stuck in limbo. Their integration journey hasn't even started yet because of all the challenges thrown up by the pandemic. So that's one group of people, a large chunk of people, large chunk of newcomers who are still just starting their settlement journey, right? And on top of that, you want to bring in 400,000 people, great. But let them also talk about how do we expand settlement services? Where is the capacity for settlement workers, the frontline workers, to support these additional numbers?
Absolutely, and I think you brought up a few good points, especially putting a human face to some of those challenges, logistically, like the kind of on the ground impacts of the pandemic on their settlement process. So I'm just looking at the questions raised by the audience in Slido here, and I'm going to use my privilege as the moderator to raise the first questions, because obviously I think in the what we've seen is I think Anna touched on this too, about the role that temporary residents play during the pandemic, and both in terms of being contributing as essential workers, and also in being that pool of immigration candidates that we could draw from when the border is closed and there's no access into the country. So my first question is, do you think that even in the past 2 decades there has been a stronger push to have a two-tiered immigration selection process to transition newcomers from temporary residents to permanent residents, either as migrant workers and increasingly through the international education stream? Do you think the pandemic would actually even push that the system towards that direction further?
Nick, is this for me, right?
It's open to all the speakers. Yeah.
Well, okay, I can start, because this is a point where I feel strongly about. Because also of my previous experience, I've lived and worked, I'm originally Greek, but I've lived and worked my adult life in different European countries. And I think even if I knew it, the reality of this one-shot migration to Canada still strikes me. So you take a decision from another country, you come, you apply for PR, you are approved, and you come, one-way ticket. It occurs to me that this is no longer how the world works. Maybe it worked like this 50 years ago, but this is no longer the case, and our analysis of immigration points to this. So I wonder whether, I mean, and I totally see and have debated in different seminars and webinars with colleagues the advantages of this. You come with full rights, minus political rights, you come with full socioeconomic rights. Of course, we know in Canada and in other countries that people with long-term status are not, I mean, they still have a few hoops to jump. They have a few hurdles to meet. And I can tell you, if that is of any help, that intra-EU migration, where people move within the European Union countries as if they were the provinces of Canada, so with full socioeconomic rights and local political rights. And oftentimes the people who are less educated, who have less networks, who move without a job offer, do face a lot of discrimination and abuse. And particularly in those industries where we see, for instance, temporary migrants facing this exploitation, like the agri-food sector for one, or you know, the caring and cleaning and, you know, janitary services. So, however, on the other hand, I do see that coming with a temporary permit does give you this Canadian experience. And I hear you, Shamir, and I like the way you put it. You say, what is Canadian, or what is Canadian experience not about? What does it mean if I come and I do not have Canadian experience? It doesn't mean I don't have the skills or the experience. It means that my prospective employer cannot understand how I fit. And I see this, that there also is a disconnect when we speak to people high up in the human resources of big banks and big companies. They say, we need to recruit more talent. Our recruiters should do more to understand the qualifications and the experience of people. But it hasn't yet trickled to that level where it should trickle. So this translation is made. And of course, for instance, the word that Wes is pioneering there is very important. But I wonder whether it wouldn't be more logical in a world like ours today, where we're so connected, where transport and community is cheap, well, at least pre-pandemic, hopefully also after the pandemic. And we're also connected, that one can come with a temporary permit and then decide to apply. So then they have the networks and the experience in place. And wouldn't that also fit, I mean, wouldn't that also fit the way we live? I mean, we have also seen something else. People come to Canada with PR, they stay, they take PR, they take citizenship, and then they leave again. I mean, we migration scholars should also look at this. So the motivations for migration are, you know, multiple and dynamic, and they can change. So I wonder whether a two-tier system, I'm not saying that we should do away with the one-step permanent residency, but that we should open up more channels. And I also see that this, I think, is important, and many people have discussed this in the past several years, not just under the pandemic, in admitting, and I think this is a problem also for European countries, admitting that our economies do not only need the nuclear scientists. We know that our economies need people at different levels of skill, and coming without a university degree doesn't mean you're going to do badly in the Canadian labor market.
But I think just a quick follow-up, but what I found interesting is the fact that the irony of, on one hand, you know, we see the benefits of the two tiers, you know, immigrant selection system, but at the same time, I also feel the pandemic has also exposed the precariousness of those who have, you know, some immigration status in Canada. I think that's the part that, you know, I found interesting.
Can I add to the conversation in terms of the two-tier immigration system? I mean, we don't admit it, but we do have a two-tier immigration system. We talk about a managed immigration system with the different groups, but the reality is that we have a formal two-tiered immigration system. And in fact, the pandemic just basically has exposed that, and we're now talking about it. And yet, I mean, what is the Canadian experience class? And when we talk about experience, what that means concretely is somebody has been in Canada and is working and has been to school. But is that experience, does it count? And does it count for our economy? So, you know, it gets really interesting for me, and I feel ambivalent around, you know, what I'm even going to say, is we have an express entry system around a point system for human capital and what people bring, and we say it's highly skilled. Then we have almost 642,000 international students. And we've just seen recent studies that show that, in fact, it's a way into Canada to get the landed status. So they're taking any course to be able to get basically a work study permit, and then they'll get a work permit, and they get the Canadian experience, and they can apply. But, you know, what jobs are they doing after? Are they then ending up working as security guards? And so, you know, you end up with a lot of people who will end up coming to Canada through the two-tiered immigration system because our borders are closed. But does it grow our economy? And are they running into the same problems as the million immigrants who came here whose skills are not recognized? So, you know, it becomes a really complex situation in terms of, on the one hand, we say we need to have more immigrants and they're going to contribute to our economy, but we haven't really intentionally thought about what does the labor market look like structurally? What do we need? And how do we make sure that it isn't just about numbers? It's about being intentional around what we need at all levels. You know, I agree with Anna, and, you know, I've seen some of the chat lines that it isn't just about highly skilled. You know, we need people at all levels in trades and whatever else. How can we be intentional even in terms of international students who are coming, who take the right courses, not just any course to get their work?
Yeah, because I think part of behind my question too was the fact that, you know, because we all know that international students, they pay 2, 3 times, 4 times, you know, tuition than our local Canadian students. So, you know, I wonder whether there's a risk of our immigration system becoming one that, you know, who can afford to come here, rather than, you know, who really, you know, would be, you know, selected based on the skills, or just who can pay the tuition so they could stay, right, with a two-tier system. So I saw anything you would like to add to this discussion, Rupa and Mohan?
Yeah, I wanted to add a couple of things. I think, you know, there's actually been a lot of really kind of large research, large level quantitative research on this topic that we need to take into account, right? So what the studies have shown is that temporary foreign workers who have a high wage job before migration, a high wage job, they do very well after they transition. I mean, this is not surprising at all. Of course, if they have a high wage job, they have a good job, which provides them with the advantages of actually being able to have career mobility once they transition. Those who do not have a high wage job as temporary foreign workers, even if they happen to be in an IMP program where they have pathways to permanent residence, so they have the right, you know, occupational classification, so they do have the privilege of getting pathways to permanent residence, they still struggle greatly after they transition. So it's not just about having a job before transitioning to permanent residence. It's the kind of job you have. And I think, Nicholas, the point you made about, you know, we're basically rewarding privilege, right? The idea that if you can afford to come as a temporary foreign worker, if you have those networks to be able to get that job on a temporary contract, and if you have the funds to actually come in as a international student, then, you know, you are rewarded by the opportunity to become permanent residents. That being said, you know, recently I've been involved in some research that's actually gone out and interviewed folks as they're going through this transition process. And this is unusual because right now we actually have very little information about temporary foreign workers, IMP folks who are actually going through the transition process. There isn't data really collected on those individuals. And the interviews that I've been involved in really show the level of bureaucracy and complication that these individuals go through to try and get permanent residence. And the maze that this becomes often then requires them to hire immigration consultants, almost always. So again, a matter of privilege, right? These are very expensive services that the IMP workers have to rely upon to try and get the right kinds of jobs, the right kinds of employer reference letters, etc., to try and get PR. So it's a very it's not this kind of straight story where, you know, if you can have a job in Canada before you transition to PR, you're going to do great. And if you come straight from abroad, then that's a problem. It's much more complicated than that. And I think we need to keep those nuances and those caveats in mind when we think of two-tier or two-step migration.
One last word, Nicholas, before we move on, is that in all of this conversation, since we had from 9 a.m. today, two words that are missing is racism and discrimination, right? I think racism and discrimination is an underlying factor in all of the challenges that we spoke about today. And it plays differently at different layers for different groups of people, right? There is the overt, open racism that we saw, the attack on the family in London. All of that we are seeing that is targeted towards Southeast Asian population communities. And then there is the covert racism that we see playing out in the systems, right? Non-recognition of skills, yes, but how long are we going to use that argument that, oh, I don't know about the company that you worked, or I don't know about your country? I think underlying all of that, still there is a sense of racism, and let's exclude that from our conversation when we talk about immigration and integration of newcomers in Canada. That's it. Thank you.
I've heard that argument in terms of how much resources IRCC actually, which I don't know if that's true, but you know, that's one criticism that I have heard even before the pandemic. The amount of resources our government put into processing applications in different, you know, on different continents, Africa, or you know, applications from Latin America, for example. Yeah, but that's interesting. So we're going to turn to some of the questions coming in on Slido. So the first questions, requiring temporary workers who have worked several years in Canada proof of language when applying for PR is discriminatory. What is your take on this? So I'm going to broaden up this question because, you know, one of the things about modernization is about streamlining the process of applications. And for example, you know, in the past, you know, year or a half, I've heard people talking about, okay, you know, there's, you know, I already submitted my medical, my police clearance, and because of the stalled processing, you know, it expired. So there, you know, there have been arguments back and forth. Should your IRCC, you know, just automatically extend the validity of those documents, or you know, have people to resubmit? And I'm just curious, in terms of the modernization, you know, in the context of modernization of the system, how much streamlining do you feel it's required just to use common sense to do things than just, you know, stick to the rules? Any volunteer to take on the question?
I can only say, I think, I mean, I'm not sure who, I've faced the immigration system as a customer too. And yeah, I think you need a PhD to navigate it. So I think it is a very well designed, very detailed, very responsive system where you can file notes about this and about that, but it is complicated. And I can totally relate to why in this 90,000 people, you know, positions program, the international students fill their quota within a matter of days, and the other two categories are struggling. And I am someone who has access to internet and a laptop and everything else. I think the question for me from a kind of policy design perspective, So first of all, I want to say we had a webinar with some colleagues from IRCC who were telling us about this big bang investment and reconfiguration of the system. And they're wary also, as I was saying, because if the migration of the system doesn't work, you can imagine what a mess this would be. So I think that will, as the minister said earlier, will help efficiency in terms of processing, etc. But in terms of the design and what people need to do, I feel the system is really very detailed. So this has both an advantage and a disadvantage. On one hand, it can cater for all these small exceptions that there can be where people say, I cannot provide this, but I can provide that. At the same time, it makes the system cumbersome and complex. And I'm still amazed as a researcher learning more about the different categories. There's a myriad of categories. There's a myriad of ad hoc programs. Even speaking, reading Rupa's policy brief reviewing past programs of aiming at transitioning people from temporary to permanent status through exceptional means. These tiny programs for tiny constituencies with so many specificities. So I wonder whether the digital efficiency should go hand in hand with a kind of design efficiency, try to simplify the program and perhaps work a little bit backwards. So we discuss some of the issues we see, some of the backlogs, some of the barriers. So try to address those barriers and design some broader categories.
Mm-hmm. Good points. And Shamira?
Trying to think about this question because it's an important question in terms of the language, and what Anna has also raised around program design. I think the whole issue of language and language proficiency is one where we need to be careful in terms of, are you using the language test to prove something, or do you need to have language tests to ensure that individuals are able to work in English or French? Because, my perspective is that even when you look at international students and others who are coming in and as a temporary foreign workers, you may not need to have the language proficiency to do the work. Mm-hmm. And then yet, as we look at the immigration criteria, you do need language to be able to survive, depending on, what you do for the long term. So I think that, this is where I don't have a direct answer. It's a point of reflection, and we need to explore this further. What is the purpose of why we're doing the language test? Is it to check off, or is it because the expectation is that the language proficiency is going to help them to have a better future? But Anna's point, which is a really important point, is that I'm starting to see boutique programs. And I don't know, when I talk about immigration, and it's all good work. My colleagues are lots of IRCC people who are listening. So it's all good work in terms of, we need a program for regionalization or agri-foods or whatever. The question I ask myself is, what is the coherency? What's the approach here? Is it about different regions? Is it about Canada? Is it about certain sectors? And where are we trying to go? Because, and maybe immigration, and they have a strategic plan around where they're trying to go with the economy and what they want to do. But I really do see a bunch of good but boutique programs, and how do we bring it together? And are we really making a difference in terms of what we're doing with these programs? Where's the evaluation and the impact?
And we are going to, I know we're running out of time, but I do want to entertain a couple more questions, including one from Professor Margaret Walton-Roberts. So I'm going to combine both questions. In terms of, sorry, I'm just going back here. Okay, so this is a question about, the skilled trades immigration. There's a comment here about, that we would need new and more effective approaches for skilled trades immigration, and what role might colleges and their trades programs play, which I think is relevant to another question that Margaret raised here. Can we plan and forecast labor needs more effectively? And Build Force Canada looks at training, immigration for construction. We need a build force for healthcare. So, for my fellow panelists, how do you, because, I think it touched on the issues about the low skill, high skilled, or the ones, the skilled people, but who don't have university degrees issues. So as we move forward, can we, how can we properly plan and forecast labor needs more effectively? Because I was exploring a potential story about, exactly on that front, how, post-COVID, we can do a better job to match immigration system with the skills that are needed. But, there's appear to be no, solution because just the way labor forecast is being done, no one can, no one has a crystal ball to look into the future, right? Same for the labor market. So as we move forward, like, do you have any advice, any suggestion how we can do a better job in terms of, doing that? Rupa.
So I think we have to be really, really careful to try and use immigration to meet short-term labor market needs. Even the data that Daniel Hebert and I used for our policy brief is imperfect in the sense that it was actually done before, it was collected before the pandemic, and it takes into account certain immigration targets already in place. So the point is, as you said, Nicholas, we don't have perfect labor market forecasting data. And we've seen this 20, 25 years ago with the whole, dot-com bubble and all of the tech folks that were brought in the late 90s, who then found after a period of time that they weren't really needed in the labor market. So, having occupation-focused immigration has not been particularly successful. I think having human capital, more general human capital-based immigration selection is the better way to go. That doesn't mean only high-skilled human capital. I think we need to take into account more broadly human capital and skills, more broadly defined, as Shamira mentioned, other aspects of skills, including certain aspects of soft skills, which are really, really hard to get at and to actually measure and very difficult to actually be able to put any kind of scoring onto. These are all important. And I think those kinds of more general skills are much more important for bringing in the kind of people that we want in Canada, in our communities, rather than we need this many nurses and this many IT specialists, because those things will change over time.
Yeah. Anyone else would like to jump in before we move into our breakout?
We can also try and simplify the process for employers here who are trying to hire on temporary foreign worker permit visas, right? I know of a friend that I was trying to help who needed a particular type of skill in the timber industry. And we all know that we import a lot of timber from Malaysia. Canada imports a lot of timber from Malaysia. And he was able to find someone with that particular skill, which is basically a risk assessment for timber and long-term projections and plantations and all of that. So something like that. And it was practically impossible for him to bring that person here on a work permit. He couldn't get till the end. He couldn't get a work permit for that person. Even that's after applying or trying to advertise and hiring for that position locally. And he ended up finding a skill in Malaysia, and he was never able to bring that person here simply because of all the complex processes that are in place. And I respect those processes because we need to have that protection in place so that we don't want everybody who are not qualified using that, like how people are using our education as a proxy immigration system to come here. But still, we also need to think of genuine employers and how we can help them bring people here in work permits, but simplify the process for them, but at the same time ensuring the integrity of the process.
Okay, so we're now going to move into our breakout rooms, and everyone will be assigned to a room automatically for 20 minutes. And we'll see you guys back here in 20 minutes. Oh, so welcome back, everyone. And so we are just going to have a quick recap from all the breakout room leaders to share with us, what some of the conclusions and takeaway that we have. So why don't you go first, Rola? Sorry, yeah, Rula.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Nicholas. Just like to introduce myself, I work for Islamic Family and Social Services Association in Edmonton. We are a sponsorship agreement holder. We sponsor refugees since like 2018. In our breakout room, we spoke about the refugee experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we started by talking about the status of refugees and how many refugees were hoping that their arrival would be soon to Canada, as they were like as they had like some communication with the visa offices asking for further documents or even scheduling their interviews. But then when the pandemic hit, there were no further communication, no update at all. So the refugees and their families here in Canada as well, they didn't know what's going on and when the visa offices will resume work. For the very few like refugees families that arrived last year during the pandemic, the main issue or challenge was like issuing their documents, like essential documents, like SIN number, for example. The family very few days before the we couldn't get SIN until like 10 months after their arrivals because every line and became complicated and there was no proper communication with like officers that we could talk to and explain the challenge. Also, the other issue we spoke about is like bring everything to like online, the digitization of classes for kids and digitization for like English classes, settlement services. Many refugees, they lack a normal like literacy and they had issue of like knowing how to deal with computer or accessing computers or even knowing how to create Gmail. And as settlement workers, we had like to step in and help them with all of this during like during the lockdown. We also talked about, I'm just like, I know you lack time, that settlement workers may be actually also overburdened with interpretation, which usually like interpretation services, which usually is not part of their work, but they had to do it because of like lack of interpretation services, and the refugees themselves, they don't understand English and they can't communicate online without the help of settlement workers.
Great, thanks for sharing. And how about for you, Rania, for your group?
Well, Nicholas, I think we had a very, very brief time. I don't know how everyone felt, but it really came down to just we were talking about the prospects that are available for newcomers, and I think the group highly recognizes that, or we've talked about how there's a recognition that there's a lot of opportunities out there. The prospects are good. Employers are saying the jobs are available, but again, and it all echoes everything we've heard in the panel through earlier, that there's this huge disconnect between the employer skill needs and the supply of newcomer skills. There's a mismatch there. There's also a need for preparing newcomers before they come to Canada on the expectations. And we're not sorry, we're not talking about just licensing expectations. For example, we had a member mention how you can get all the certifications needed, but then what happens when you hit the residency? It's the full process and not just the reading through and saying this is what is required to hit it. It's the reality of how you're going to achieve that that needs to be clarified to newcomers and prepared. We also touched on how there is an imbalance of skills and skill mobilization across the country. So you have sometimes you have a lot of people who of a certain skill are available in one province. They're highly concentrated there and they're highly unemployed. And yet you go to other areas, and those areas really need that skill, but no one is inviting there, or there's no efforts being done to be able to mobilize that skill across the country. We touched on that as well. And of course, we also, when it came to employers, there is still a lot of work and a lot of room to work on the racism and discrimination that happens through the assessing of skills and interviewing and even being just open and connected to newcomers. And the last point is knowing that there's a lot of prospects in more rural areas and there's a lot of need to fill those areas. How welcoming and how prepared are they to welcome a newcomer settlement to be able to fill those skill gaps? And so you can't really take out the fact that, oh, the job there exists. But then how is that place really welcoming for me and my family to settle and support the economy?
Thanks, Rania. And Joan.
Unmute myself. Yeah, the breakout group that I was in was focused on internationally educated health professionals and the pandemic. So I just spoke for a couple of minutes about, I think the fact that the pandemic put a very clean point on the underutilization of internationally educated health professionals, immigrant health professionals. And frankly, there were no real systematic initiatives through the pandemic to utilize those skills or to find ways to fast track that really didn't happen during the pandemic. We talked about some statistics of the very high rates of underutilization of the skills of internationally educated health professionals. I showed a video from a campaign of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship called Equal Chance, where a group of internationally trained physicians are talking about some of the barriers that they're facing and the fact that they are doctors, but they're not doctors in Canada, and what that looks like. The issue is fairly straightforward. The solutions in the health professions in particular are complex. But the bottom line is that we need the needs of our healthcare system are growing, and we're facing shortages. Internationally trained health professionals are and always have been a core part of our healthcare system, but their skills are extremely underutilized, and we don't have a system that moves people from immigration and getting points for. I mean, even under the current, as we know, the essential skills, the essential workers pathways, there is a healthcare pathway. It's undersubscribed at this point. And while people may get permanent residency, that's not tied to a system that is going to take them from residency to registration in their professions and integration into the labor market. People will still get stuck in that pathway. So what we talked about and it was put on the table by someone in the comments as well, is the need for a national strategy that actually looks at that whole pathway and ties together the immigration issues, the regulatory and licensure pathway challenges, and the labor market integration issues into a coherent pathway with a coherent strategy. A couple of people in our group did raise the issue of, if there are so many internationally educated nurses, for instance, who are the backbone of the PSW workforce in Canada, what does it mean if we move them all into nursing positions? What happens to the PSW workforce? And I think, that is part of the reform, and someone raised working conditions and risks to people who were in those frontline roles during the pandemic and the rates of COVID infection among frontline racialized and immigrant workers. And so I think it's about both looking at the working conditions in those sectors, making those viable sectors and making those sectors more attractive so that we could be recruiting people into PSW roles who aren't necessarily already overqualified for those roles, if we make the reforms to those sectors that would make those more attractive places to work and to stay.
Right, thanks, Joan. So the room that I led, the discussion that I led was on migrant workers during the pandemic. So just a quick recap, a couple of quick things that, the concerns or comments made by the participants. One, with a growing number of temporary residents in Canada, there's a need, it speaks to the need to have funding, to provide support and services to temporary residents in the settlement sector. So there's a need to to really reevaluate, how we can better support the temporary residents, especially in a time of crisis like during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you know, and I think there was also a consensus about the value of having the TR to PR pathway during the pandemic. And there was a discussion about turning this into a more systemic and permanent program to allow the traditionally lower skilled, low wage migrant workers to transition to the PR. But there was also concern raised about whether IRCC or the government would then raise the standards or the requirements, more scrutiny when admitting temporary residents as such. And so those, would be, were some of the, I think, the things that we need to think about. That wraps up the official, that's the end of our discussion. And I just have some quick remarks. I feel really honored to be here and inspired by the insights shared by everyone. Even though I've been covering the immigration beat the last 18 years, a long time, I still feel like we haven't talked about immigration enough, especially in the last year and a half. If we think that, our lives being turned upside down by the pandemic, and think about those who don't even have full status here in Canada, and the impacts, on those lives already in limbo. And so we don't know when this pandemic will be over and when the next one is going to strike. But the lessons we learned this time hopefully can help better prepare us to fill the gaps, plug the holes, and address the existing challenges and get ready for the next one. And I'm going to turn the mic to Stephanie from First Policy Response for closing. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you so much for guiding us in this conversation today. It was a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we've all we've learned so much from gathering together today. To start off with, I'd like to thank all of those who made this event happen after many months of planning. The core team at First Policy Response, including Kareem Bardisi, Matthew Mendelson, Sahar Shafiq, Katria Bolger, and Braylon Guppy. Many thanks to CERC Migration and Integration at Ryerson University for being a co-presenting partner for this event and for helping with the event design and organization. Thank you to our media partner, the Toronto Star. Thank you to Nicholas Keung, our moderator, and to Irene Gentle and Keith Bonnell. Thank you to Minister Marco Mendicino and his office. Thank you to our speakers and commentators. Thank you for sharing your candid insights and perspectives with us. And finally, to you, the audience, thank you for joining us for this important conversation. We'd like to keep this conversation going. So if you have any ideas or questions, or if you'd like to perhaps write something about this, you can email us at policyresponse@ryerson.ca. And you can find a whole bunch more on this topic and other policy issues dealing with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic at policyresponse.ca as well. Finally, I'd like to point out that we have an op-ed on the topic of international students. It's called Why Canada's COVID Recovery Needs to Include International Students. And that was presented in partnership with the Toronto Star. You can read it at policyresponse.ca or on thestar.com. And finally, visit policyresponse.ca to sign up for our Friday newsletter or to find out more information about these topics. And we will be having a recording of this event. We'll be sharing it on FPR's social media channels and our newsletter. So you can keep an eye on Twitter. Our handle is @policyresponse. And you can also find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. And we're hoping to have that video available to share with you in the next couple of days. So thank you again for joining us. We hope you have a great weekend and a wonderful day. Please take care.